Hello, I'm Matt Califano. I attend Craftsbury Academy in Vermont. We'll be moving on to the featured address shortly, which will be introduced by Mr. David Bahnsen. Mr. Bahnsen is the founder, managing partner, and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group. They manage $5 billion of client assets. Before he launched the Bahnsen Group, Mr. Bahnsen worked at Morgan Stanley for 8 years, and before that, he spent 6 years at UBS. He is consistently ranked one of the top investment advisors in America by Barron's, Forbes, and the Financial Times. He's also a published author. Mr. Bahnsen wrote There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths, and published just last month, Full Time, Work and the Meaning of Life. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Bahnsen to the stage.
Well, it's not merely a privilege to be introducing today's keynote speaker, David Malpass, but it is a privilege to be here at the event itself, sponsored by such a crucially important organization as the Coolidge Foundation, whose chairwoman and CEO, Amity Shlaes, is nothing short of a national treasure. A conference on our national debt is important, but as a glass is half full eternal optimist, I think our national treasures warrant coverage as well. Amity is one of those, a happy warrior, ideologically consistent, philosophically rooted, and productive. She is incomparably productive. And productivity is not just the name of the game when we talk about people I respect, like my friend Amity Shlaes. It is the economic antidote to debt. On one side of the ledger is government debt, the corollary to productivity. Not only does excessive government indebtedness pull forward into the present what would have been future growth and resourcefulness, but it almost always suboptimally allocates resources in the present. It is a basic tautology that government spending moves resources from the productive part of the economy to the non-productive. Fighting for productivity is the economic but also moral cause of our day, whether people know it or not. I am proud to share this stage today with so many patriots who know this and who have devoted much of their lives to this cause. We must not grow weary. Today's keynote speaker, David Malpass, is one such individual who has devoted his life and career to the cause of productivity. Through remarkable Treasury and State Department service covering 3 U.S. presidents, an accomplished time on Wall Street, and most recently as one of the most effective presidents of the World Bank in history, David is an advocate for productivity. He has been a leader in the cause of cogent energy policy, of adequately capitalizing our global energy and agricultural needs, and of sound monetary policy. He has repeatedly stood against the misallocation of capital that overly interventionist monetary policy represents. And not just the inequity of policy tools like quantitative easing, but particularly the way in which such policy tools work against productivity. But I would be remiss if I did not point out one of the great contributions to the subject of excessive sovereign debt David has brought forward. In his work at the World Bank, David tied the food shortages of emerging markets to excessive global debt. And what greater way to demonstrate the inhumanity of reckless debt than to demonstrate its connectivity to starvation? Our work as economists is human. It concerns itself with the human person. And for today's speaker, the collateral damage done by bad policy, by excessive debt, by forfeiting productivity is human damage. He understands this and has allowed it to drive significant advocacy for a more cogent and sustainable economic landscape. It is for that reason that I'm so honored to introduce today's keynote speaker, David Malpass.
Holy mackerel. Thank you, David Bahnsen. That was very nice. I'm playing second fiddle to our fabulous interlude, but really I'm playing 10th fiddle to what a fabulous conversation we heard this morning from the panelists. And so I'm at a loss because I know I can't do better than that. And I want to really thank Amity Schlaze for putting this together, and also Bill Beach for guiding all of this. So one round there. They're both old friends. My topic today is how to stop the debt explosion. I'm not an academic, so as I say, I'm at a loss in trying to keep up with the panels this morning. I was at one fiddle recitation. My wife Adele is here with me, and we were at Biarritz for the G7 meeting in 2020. President Macron was there and President Trump and the other world leaders. And we worked all day in a conference, kind of like this, except much smaller, couple tables. And then at lunch, there was a fabulous violinist like we had, which leavened the mood. It was actually a dinner. But the problem was the conference all day long did not have any of the insights that we had this morning. One of my frustrations as World Bank president and before that as the Undersecretary for Treasury was I've been to how many dozens and dozens of conferences where all day long people talk and there really is no outcome from the meetings. So one of the things we need to struggle with today as we hear the afternoon sessions is how can we use the energy and the insights of this conference, this specific conference. So you've heard the luminaries this morning, and there's another whole set of panels, luminaries this afternoon, and they have better judgment than I think than all the world leaders. So let's think about that. I want to set the stage and then offer 4 policy solutions, and then if we have, and then I'll try to get done fast and we can take questions. I was hired, we heard David Stockman talk about the cheap apartment here, and I started with the Senate Budget Committee in 1984 as an economist and the token CPA, and I'm eternally grateful to the Budget Committee because that's how I met my wife Adele. We're budget nerds, we own it. We lived through the Gebhardt rule, the Byrd rule on germaneness, the Graham-Rudman-Hollings, Paul Volcker's linkage of the deficit to interest rates, which was a significant moment in roughly 1986, where there was an admission by the Fed that their interest rates had something to do, vice versa, in both directions, with the size of the budget deficit. And we also lived through dynamic scoring. So those are all topics and problems that are going on now. At the time that I started, the national debt was $1.4 trillion. It had crossed through $1 trillion at the beginning of the Reagan administration. I went through 2 budget cycles, the COBRA reconciliation bill, and then I moved to the Treasury Department to work for James Baker on currencies, on tax reform, and on the debt limit increases. At the time, currencies were gyrating, so I listened carefully to Jim Grant's explanation of the 1950s and 60s. The warning signs had been on before the U.S. pulled out of the gold standard. So if only we had honored those signs and taken steps at that time, we wouldn't have ended up with the crisis of 1980. But we did, and in came, my firm view is that if Carter had taken steps to defend the dollar and to address the tax increases that were being caused by inflation. Remember, the income tax wasn't indexed for inflation at that time, and capital gains still isn't. So when inflation goes up, you're suffering this giant tax increase. So Reagan won, and other countries in the 70s had floated their currencies, so you ended up with this global global crisis of the 70s, and in came new policies that were able to stabilize it. But before that happened, as we departed from the gold standard, the IMF lost its purpose. And we heard that this morning, that the original purpose from the Bretton Woods organizations was to, when a country ran a trade deficit, there would be an adjustment process. But that's lost when you lose the anchor to commodities. We ended up with fiat money, and that meant that there isn't really an anchor for world policy now. We've also, and we heard about it this morning, lost the moral responsibility of balancing the budget after using it for emergencies. And so we're adrift in terms of both fiscal and monetary policy. We see what a crisis looks like. That occurred in 1978 as Jimmy Carter wanted to sell more and more government bonds. The market stopped taking them. The weak dollar made it so hard to sell normal Treasury bonds that in 1978 and 1979, Treasury stooped to issuing bonds in Swiss francs and in Deutschmarks. This was a direct affront to the Hamiltonian norm that Bill Beach had described to us, where the Hamiltonian norm is that you can issue high-quality debt and people accept that debt. So we lost that ability in 1978. And as I say, if Carter had seen the signs or taken action, I think the crisis could have been averted ahead of time. Reagan came in. The stock market, Reagan came in, remember, and wanted to defend the dollar and implement supply-side tax and regulatory policies that empowered markets. So that's critical as far as the recovery from the crisis. The stock market bottomed in August '82, and the economy enjoyed 17 quarters of growth of 3.5% or more, 17 quarters from 1983 to 1988. So we need to remember now, as we push forward with the current decade, that the bar needs to be pretty high. We need a lot of growth in order to raise median income standards and to have a peace through strength policy around the world. For Reagan, 4 quarters exceeded 6%. So we need to be thinking in terms of high expectations on productivity, as David Bahnsen said, and on growth. This fast growth formed the bedrock, the American bedrock, of peace through strength against which Soviet socialism crumbled. Over the subsequent decades, budgeting changed. We lost the taboo or the moral hazard that James Buchanan had talked about, the taboo against deficits. And we also saw entitlements grow, and we heard a lot about that. And as Phil Graham pointed out, very importantly, the means-tested social programs have grown massively. So fast forward, national debt now is exploding. It will top $35 trillion by the political conventions this summer. It will pass $36 trillion by year end. It will pass $40 trillion by the 2026 midterm elections. So one of the conversations that people have had for 40 years in Washington, if only politicians had backbone, we could get at the budget deficit problem. So I really want to lay out a key point in the solution here. We have to give that up. Politicians are paid to spend money. That's how they get reelected. And so there really isn't any chance of expecting there to be a reassertion of the moral responsibility within Washington. As we heard today, the question was put to Ronald Reagan, which was more dangerous, Moscow, the Soviet capital, or Washington, and he didn't want to answer that because it wasn't very clear. And so where I'm going to lead is that we have to think in terms of changing the rules, not the people, because whoever is in either party, they're centered in Washington, and they're going to insist on spending more money than the nation can produce. As we think about this, the president and Congress today are working frantically on huge spending bills, and this will leave an even deeper and fiscal train wreck immediately after the January inauguration. So imagine, new president comes in, what are they going to face in January and February of 2025? First, the suspension of the debt limit expires on January 1. So immediately you're in a debt limit crisis. I worked on those for James Baker. I worked through those in the Trump administration. They're a constant problem because they encourage Washington to make bad budget deals. And so we have to break from that, and I'm going to lay out the idea that we have to use the debt limit itself as a way to get to a size limit on government. That's going to be the key changeover. Second, the new president will face spending bills that have to be done all over again. So they're doing them right now, but they're only going to last for a few months, and then you go through the same process all over again with all of the same problems: entitlements, defense spending, Social Security, means-tested spending, and so on. Only the swamp benefits, and we've seen how giant the boom is in Washington, D.C. over these years. So every added $1 trillion to the national debt, somebody in Washington makes a big percentage on that. And so the incentives are overwhelming to keep it going. And third, the tax rates will rise at the end of 2025 unless there's a big tax bill to extend the 2017 tax provisions. So when we put it all together, compared to 1980, which was a true crisis to the point where the U.S. stooped to issuing bonds in foreign currencies because people didn't want the dollar. Think of that. On the one hand, it's worse now. The government's debt is much higher relative to GDP. It was 32% of GDP in 1980. And it's 122% now. I'm using total debt, including debt owed by the trust fund. So 32 in Carter was enough to cause a global scale crisis. We're at 122% now. But in important ways, it's less severe than 1980. Inflation is not as high. Median income has lost ground, but not as much as it did in the 1970s. Gold is at a record high today, even as we speak. This morning it was $21.62 per ounce. But it had risen much more in the 1970s. What percentage was it going up per year or per, and the answer is a lot more than it is now. The dollar is still valued as a world currency, allowing us to continue the sale of dollar-denominated treasury debt. So this raises the important question of whether the national debt can keep going up, whether monetary policy can provide price stability in the face of huge fiscal deficits. This is the fiscal dominance question. Have we switched over to the spot where monetary policy can't protect us? And whether the global economy can withstand the strain of this. So the U.S. is fighting out this giant battle of policy, and can the world withstand it? So I think the answers to those questions are yes, maybe, and no. Yes, the national debt can keep rising. Maybe the Fed will use its powerful tools to protect us from inflation and from dollar weakness. And no, I think the global economy is the Achilles heel. So I'm going to take a little different stance than some of what we heard this morning. I think the U.S. has created such a strong economy and strong military over these decades since Reagan that it has the ability to keep issuing money. The debt to GDP limit can go up and up and up. I mentioned we're going to go straight through 40 trillion. We'll go straight through $50 trillion. CBO is already forecasting $50 trillion, and no one in Washington even looks up as that is happening. So we have this continuation of the current system where the U.S. can just offer enough interest to take up all the capital of the world. The consequence of that is what I wrote a lot about from the World Bank. It's the idea that the capital flows of the world are being redirected toward the government of the United States, including the state and local governments, which are going wild in terms of their amounts of spending. And they are so creditworthy, we are so creditworthy, that we can soak all of the capital out of the world before we are forced into the crisis that Phil Gramm was rightly talking about and worrying about. So I think my vision of what the problem is a little different than others. Wall Street will find ways to sell U.S. government debt out the kazoo, and the Fed is standing there ready to buy huge amounts. Remember the oddity of QE? So there was propounded by economists this idea that if the Fed just bought bonds, it would be stimulative, which has never really been documented as far as what the transmission mechanism for that would be. We are now in this situation where the Fed is saying if it just keeps interest rates high enough, inflation will go down. But they aren't asked how and why would inflation go down. Is there going to be more production in the economy due to the high interest rates? Clearly not. So what the high interest rates are doing is pushing money through the U.S. government out to wealthy people, to savers, and also the government itself is hiring and employing so many people that if the Fed waits to see the economy weaken or the unemployment rate to go up, it may take a long time to achieve that. So I think we need to think in terms of new models, wholly new models for the Federal Reserve that are based on sound money as the underpinning, the anchor for price stability. That would be a huge departure from the Phillips curve and the demand management that we hear from the Fed at present. In the meantime, though, as far as the international impact, we're seeing it every day. Europe's in recession. China is slowing down and really in a recession if you properly measured it. Japan has been in a long period of growth that's so weak it might as well be a recession. And in poorer countries than those, I was mentioning the ones with higher interest rates. In poorer countries, it's worse. They have been fully cut off from financial markets and from borrowing, so they turn to their domestic banks and borrow the money from them that should have gone to the private sector within their economies. They're basically just following what's happening in the U.S. The Fed is the biggest borrower from banks, huge. It's been a misnomer. People say the Fed's printing money. It's not. It's paying interest on borrowed money. So we're basically financing a big chunk of the national debt with overnight borrowing from banks and from money market funds via this new mechanism set up at the Fed. So we've gone from a fiscal and monetary system that used to be based on the gold standard. It used to be based on the moral authority of people to return to balanced budgets after spending in a crisis, to a wholly new system where there's no anchor for the dollar and where there is no limit on government borrowing. So let me try to wrap up and tell you solutions, and then see if there are questions from all of this diatribe. I hope I set expectations low because we've had such fabulous panels this morning and will again in the afternoon. The first part of the solution, and I alluded to it, is we have to recognize that no one in Washington intends to change any of what we've laid out as the crisis. And from my meetings abroad, which, as I mentioned, were innumerable and endless, not in a single one of them was there the value that you heard from each panelist this morning. So literally none of the world's elite are talking about anything that will help their people have more productivity or more growth. And so we have to recognize it's just not going to happen by itself. That leads me to the debt limit. In so I worked on the debt limits for Reagan, working for James Baker at Treasury. So in 86, 87, Reagan hated those. Baker hated those. He had to call Democrats and say, I will promise to bring enough Republican votes that we can get this through. And then they would put the squeeze on the Democrats, and the debt limit would be increased under the threat of default. And so we have to take default off the table and have a much stronger national debt limit. I think it should be considered a size limit on government. It should limit both spending and taxation when we're above the debt to GDP ratio. Take the marketable debt to GDP right now is going through 100%. So that's a good round number. And so the idea would be to say when we're above 100% debt to GDP ratio, Washington feels the pain, not the country, not the global financial markets. We can't keep threatening a default. We have to say no hiring in Washington, no senior executive service person in the government gets a raise, and I think it should go out to the public. What do you think should happen to Washington when they spend wildly? And we will get lots of good ideas from people around the country on things that can be done to Washington to go directly at the swamp when the debt to GDP ratio is above 100% of GDP. So we need a size limit on Washington. And I think the only way to do that, Washington will never do it by choice. We have to go to the public, the nation as a whole, and say, don't you want Washington to be controlled? Otherwise, your destiny is to work the rest of your life for Washington. That's really the current state of affairs. A second thing that I think is important to put this together is the Fed has to speak up on defending the dollar, that it's not going to be the weak link in this. They have fully the power to support the dollar. They aren't doing it now. So again, gold is at a record high, but it won't be too hard for the Fed to do that. They have to say that they're not going to endlessly be buying government debt. They've become part of the fiscal problem by buying so many types of government debt. They buy bills, notes, bonds, tips, mortgage-backed securities. Now, they were able to buy corporate bonds and municipal bonds during COVID. And so we don't know the constitutional limits on the Fed. And we also have to recognize that it has become even more powerful than Treasury. When Treasury pays interest on the national debt, they use an appropriation, a mandatory appropriation, so it's not too hard for them to get it, but it still has to be submitted in the budget. The Fed doesn't do that. It has unlimited borrowing authority and unlimited authority, or appears to have that, to pay interest. So it can use some of that and genuinely declare defense of the dollar that will last for decades and decades. That would allow interest rates to come down, more dynamism for small businesses, which right now are really hurting because of the height of interest rates that's being imposed on them by a Fed that thinks the goal is to stop growth in the economy, stop consumption growth in the economy. So it's a bad model that we're in right now, but I think it's quite correctable. And then also, and we need to point out, the huge power that the Fed has accumulated, in addition to paying interest, unlimited to banks and money market funds, buying instruments, government debt instruments of unlimited quantities. They ran it up to $9 trillion at one point. Think of that, out of thin air, $9 trillion of government debt bought up by one institution. And then thirdly, they've acquired huge regulatory power through Dodd-Frank, sorry, apologies if Phil is still here, through Dodd-Frank. And so recognizing that authority has to be used for the U.S. national interest, not for Europe's national interest or international organizations. I was very happy to see Chairman Powell yesterday say that the Basel III in-game rules were still being being examined by the Fed, and that we were at the beginning of the examination process. So the implication he was giving yesterday in testimony to the Hill, to the House, was that there would be a re-examination of the Basel III in-game rules. That's very important because we have to find, and I'll end on this point, the power to have fast growth into the future, not only in the U.S. but in the rest of the world. There has to be some concept of human prosperity. And thank you, David Bahnsen, for noting the trade-offs. The trade-off that we're making right now is we're paying top dollar interest out of the U.S. government to the wealthy around the world who are very happy with the dynamic that has been created. But at the same time, there's not enough fertilizer for farmers. The poverty rates are rising in countries around the world. And from my experience, nobody in positions of power really has any intention of changing that dynamic. So it's up to us, to you here, and to people that understand this combination, that we've lost the moral responsibility, so we need rules in order to control the size of government. And second, we've lost within the monetary policy system the Hamiltonian norm of issuing good quality debt. And so we have to reestablish that. And I think it needs to be done by clear declaratory statements of policy by the U.S. government, that we're going to break this cycle. It's going to be good for our growth. It's going to be good for world growth. And it's going to be confidence inspiring. We heard from the panel about the importance of trust, that you build trust and you can lose it in a moment. But I want to end on the happy note. All of my view of looking at this is all of these problems can be addressed piece by piece, but there has to be a clear direction to do it. We can't, for example, say, well, if only we had a crisis, we could begin to fix the crisis. And we can't say, oh, well, if we only had politicians that were courageous, we could fix the problem. I want us to start really with a clearer view that we're missing a rule within the Constitution and within the rule of law on the size of government. We have to have a method to establish that. And then second, there has to be some constraints on the Fed's power, because right now it's unconstrained, and that means you can make mistakes, as we have seen occasionally. Let me stop there and really emphasize the positive view that all of this is fixable with the right policy directions. Bill, all right?
Thank you.
Okay. Can I sit down?
Okay.
I'm eyeing those.
Yeah. Okay. Good enough.
Is there a gold coin
I'm going
in
to
there?
sit here with your gift as an incentive for even better answers than we had today this morning. So I'll help you with identifying folks, and I'd like to finish at 1:15. So we have about 12 minutes for questions. You have a question, right?
I see so many friends in the audience. I see Steve Hinton. I see Jimmy Kemp. And Jack Kemp was critical in thinking about how we could get out of the monetary policy rut. And so we, in the audience, and Steve Forbes is over there. In this group, there's huge talent.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I mean, this is such a distinguished audience. The first person hand, what we have right back here, Nathaniel.
Mr. Hinserling. Hello,
So the
I
Washington
see you.
Monument Syndrome, some people may be familiar with that, right? When there's a budget issue, whatever, politicians go after the most painful and least economic solutions. And so how do you I mean, do we have to have a constitutional amendment to affect this?
Yeah, and let's argue about that nationwide. That's not actually what they do. They close down the national parks. So think what people whose income comes from tourism think about that. Think about all the people that had their summer plans to go to a national park. And Washington says we're going to close down those parks. So I think if it were closing down the Washington Monument and the mall and the Washington Metro, but then also not letting, I think I would like people to think creatively about this, not having Congress people travel abroad except for national emergencies. You know, there'd have to be some exceptions to it. But think what happens every time they have a recess. And I used to be a congressional staffer. We would look forward to the recesses, chance to, you could plan out your life vacations on the congressional time schedule. So breaking that would be one part of it. I think making it harder to add things to appropriations bills. I don't want to get too far into zero-based budgeting. Remember Jimmy Carter tried that in 1977 or 78, the idea that we should start with zero for everybody and then dole out the money from zero, and it floundered right away. So I'm not proposing that. I want to make it really painful for the Washington swamp to operate. You know, the government has become the biggest donor to donor to charities, to nonprofits. So they've found a way to appropriate money and then give it to friends who spend it for the public purpose, ostensibly. But that would be one where if you could harness all of the nonprofits around the country and say, you say you're worried about world hunger. So but the U.S. is chewing up all of the money. So what about no nonprofit donations by the U.S. government when we're over the debt limit? And that would force the attention of people on Washington to the things that Phil and all the other panelists were talking about, whether it's social entitlement, scale back, and the other appropriations and authorization processes.
I think, Mr. Bahnsen, you have a question.
David, I'm curious, your idea is based on sort of a balance sheet restriction, debt to GDP. What about tying it to more of a P&L, annual budget deficit connected to GDP? Or is it a both and in your scenario, or do you think it's more effective limiting it to an aggregate debt to GDP?
I'm a little bit of an outlier. I'm against annual budget deals because Congress is so adept at cheating on those. So they say they're going to do this, and then you say, but the debt kept going up. How'd you do that? Well, it was a dire emergency appropriation, or it was all the different tricks. So I think it has to be cumulative. We need to use the marketable debt to GDP as the limiting, because otherwise they'll promise every year to balance the budget or to reduce it by 50 billion or whatever. Washington makes huge money in those debates, and they're doing that right now. So you see the appropriations bills going through, but it's the same thing when they do it under the debt limit games. And I heard Chris just now was making the point that the last time this worked, meaning annual deficit reduction, was the Greenspan Commission. If I recall, that was 82, 83. Steve Hinton probably worked on it, and others here. And that was when they changed the Social Security retirement age. But it's been that long since there was any actual reduction in the rate of growth of Washington.
That's amazing. We have a question right back in here.
Chris DeMuth, who I was referring to there. Yes, sir.
Hi. Thank you for the overview so far that we've heard. You alluded to this earlier a bit when you said if things don't change, Americans are going to have to end up working for Washington forever. As the title of this keynote is Stopping the Debt Explosion, what exactly is the debt explosion? Like, what is the worst case scenario we're trying to avoid, and what does that look like for the average American?
Yeah, so the worst case is $60 trillion of debt and a debt to GDP ratio that ramps to 200% debt to GDP. We're at 122% right now, but we're exactly on track to 200%. And what that means, and somebody said it rightly this morning, in fact, David Bahnsen said it exactly right, that I'll phrase it my way, if I spend $1 trillion right now, it's not the debt service that kills me. It's the actual, I took the debt that next year you can't borrow that same trillion. You only get to borrow it once. So if we've now borrowed $34 trillion, that really comes directly from future generations. You're in a younger age bracket than I am. And so as Washington is spending money, they're taking money that you needed to spend 20 years from now to pay my Social Security. And so we have to recognize that it's that the explosion is directly harming future generations to benefit politicians today.
Yeah, amen to that. I think we have one question back here, and then we'll go to Patrick Bunnell for the next question.
So you mentioned that like limits need to be set on the Fed, and that this kind of change would need to come from the public. So how do you envision that would come about? Would it be some kind of awareness initiative, and would that need to come from someone within or outside of Washington?
I said that the change on spending needs to come from outside Washington because it will never voluntarily stop. But the Fed has substantial control over its own destiny. And so I think it should decide that it's going to have a smaller balance sheet. That means borrow less from banks and from money market funds, just as a path forward for monetary policy, and that it would defend the dollar. Those are all within its, that it would defend the dollar as a critical step in its primary mission, which is price stability and full employment. So, the Fed says all the time, our mandate and our requirement and everything we do is going to be aimed at full employment and price stability. It's only a tiny step for them to say, to have long-term price stability. It's obvious that the dollar has to be a store of value and retain its value over time. And so that's easy for the Fed to just say. One thing I've recommended is that in their models of inflation, so the Fed, is constantly showing us projections and dot plots of what they think growth is going to be and inflation is going to be. Just make sure that you have in those models the value of the dollar is a key variable. So I'm only switching you a little bit. There doesn't need to be public input on that, and I wouldn't, of course everyone can comment on it, and academics especially, but I think it can just be done. It's within current power and would substantially and materially add to the growth rate of the country. If we had been doing a different monetary policy in 2010, 11, 12, and 13, remember the government had fixed the interest rate at 0 and was driving down. It was almost like an Operation Twist. We heard about that on the panel this morning. That's when the government manipulates the yield curve to flatten it. And that just killed investment. So the growth was weak, and we needlessly went through that dynamic of 2% growth. One of the huge campaign items in 2016, and I wrote about it in the New York Times, was that the Democrats were saying they aspired to the CBO growth forecast, which was 1.9% per year for like 10 years. And so it left a giant opening for a political campaign to say, that can't possibly be all you expect of the United States. We expect more. And I think we should be doing that right now. They're tending on that same problem, that the tyranny of low expectations is really settling in. And my concern about that is it dooms the rest of the world to underinvestment and to poverty, to malnutrition for children, if we, the U.S., insist on only growing 2% or whatever our forecasts are right now. They're too low.
That's such an important point. It may be unfair to you, David, but the last question will go to my intern, Patrick Bahnsen.
No fair. Somebody that knows something.
He knows a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Beach. My understanding of your argument, Mr. Malpass, is that we have lost the ability to be trusted to pay back our loans and to balance our budget, that the norm has been broken, and you offer the very practical solution of legislating it. If we can no longer be trusted morally on the basis of integrity and custom and tradition to pay back our loans, we should put it into law. You have brought this up, so many other panelists have brought this up, Senator Graham. My question is, why can we no longer be trusted to pay back our loans? What has changed so that America has gone from a nation which had the best credit in the world right after the revolution, and for many years followed that norm? Why have we entered this stage of, dubious reliability? And as you said, why does it seem like so many of the world's elites are uninterested in trying to solve this problem? That's my question.
I want to do a little of this. Thank you. Good question, but I want to do a little of the same to rephrase it a little bit. I think that we're at risk of losing trust in the dollar, and we heard from Jim Grant the critical nature. Once you lose it, and Jimmy Carter found that out, it's hard to get it back. I think right now we have total world trust in the U.S. on the debt. That's showing on the lowness of the yields for the U.S. So we don't need trust for that. We need actual growth plans in order to reinforce our ability over the long term to pay the debt and to actually figure out some limitations on our spending during time. So I want to a little bit refine the Hamiltonian norm. Lives, correct me, we have world experts in this, and I know zero, but lives on trust, that you trust the quality of the debt being issued. We still have that. So what we don't have is a mechanism to control the size of government. So we need to establish that.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking David Malpass.